I'm Carl Morrison, and I'm an ecosystem biologist in the Campbell River Natural Resource District with the Ministry of Forest Lands, Natural Resource Operations, and Rural Development. Yeah, the ministry as a whole is responsible for wildlife and habitat management and monitoring at a provincial level. As an ecosystem biologist, we tend to focus on species and habitats that come with various levels of protection measures or legal designations. And working in the Campbell River District, I tend to focus at a geographic scope that's at the district level, which is essentially the middle third of Vancouver Island and includes a portion of the mainland coast. But I also work pretty closely with other district and regional biologists throughout the West Coast region, which extends across all of Vancouver Island, up the central mainland coast and over to Haida Gwaii as well. So it's a pretty broad area, and the work can kind of cover both of those geographic regions at times. So today we're in the Beaver Lodge Forest Lands, which is a natural green space in the city limits of Campbell River. And we're here to talk about some tools that we're using for monitoring some of these wildlife and habitat management objectives that we have at a bigger landscape. But we've kind of got a unique opportunity here today because we're using one of those tools in the Beaver Lodge lands right now to kind of monitor the progression of what we see around us, which is a beaver pond that's recently, over the last few years, has expanded, and the beavers are pretty active in this area. And so we're using a remote camera to monitor this progression and also just look at the various types of wildlife species that use this area and the activity of those critters in our very own green space here in Campbell River. So we've arrived at our camera site, and I thought I'd just point out how these cameras work and why we've set this particular one up here where we have. These are, lots of folks are probably familiar with this sort of thing. It's called a remote camera or a trail camera or a camera trap. And essentially they work when an animal triggers the camera through motion or through infrared radiation, so through body heat. So these cameras can operate day and night. At nighttime they switch to infrared monitoring and we get a black and white image of any animals that are moving by. In this case we thought we would set it up because we're kind of monitoring this area for interest's sake and to kind of watch the progression of this forest and this beaver pond complex evolve. We thought we'd set it up in an area where we had a good shot of one of their downstream dams. And so you could expect that this is where beaver activity might be highest for now. And we would also be able to watch this forest change over time as it shifts to more of a wetland type habitat. So when we first set it up here, this was the most downstream dam. There's now one more dam located a bit further downstream. So this is the camera body and pretty tiny little units. And we've had, it'll often tell you how many triggers it's had since you've checked it last. So in this case we were in here not too long ago. I'm not expecting a whole lot of different new events, but we can have a look and see what we've got here. So in addition to being a motion censored or infrared censored camera, we also set these cameras up to take a time-lapse picture every day at the same time. So generally we set that to be noon, so the sun's nice and high in the sky and you get some good light. And that serves two functions. One is when we're interested in an area like this, it gives you this time-lapse sequence of how things change over time. The other thing is, if you're using a tool like this for a larger monitoring project and you're using these to sample different wildlife types or different habitat types, it also gives you an indication of how long you've sampled for. So if you come out to your camera and it's been ripped down by a bear, which happens relatively frequently, or the batteries are dead or the camera card is full, you get this daily timestamp of how long that camera was actually working and how long it sampled for. So in this case, we're looking at some wildlife photos that we've gotten in the last couple of weeks. And we also get a daily picture of how, what's been happening in the woods. Why we put the camera up in this particular spot was because we wanted to kind of monitor the progression of the beaver activity in this area. And so this gave us a good vantage point of one of their most downstream dams and some of the forest that's getting flooded. But with time, we've seen quite a number of critters walk essentially right where I'm standing here today. Any animal that's large enough to trip the camera that we would expect to find probably here in the Beaver Lodge lands we've seen basically at this site. That includes smallest to largest. We've seen squirrels, mink, marten, beavers of course. The beavers tended to, before this was flooded, they were coming up over the dam and had a little bit of a run down to the lower site where they were working on a beaver dam further downstream. We've seen raccoons move through here, any number of deer, bears, cougars, and we've even seen an elk wander past as well. So you get a good sense of the biodiversity that uses, in this case, one little patch of forest, because we've essentially just got one site set up monitoring this little 15-foot stretch of forest between the camera tree and the beaver pond. So remote cameras are becoming increasingly popular for wildlife and habitat managers as a tool to monitor ecological processes at various scales. One of the reasons why these cameras, or several reasons why these cameras are so popular, is because they can monitor for multiple different species simultaneously. So you can collect information on any range of critters that are large enough or warm enough to trip one of these cameras, whereas some more traditional habitat or wildlife monitoring techniques are often geared specifically for a certain species. In this case, as I mentioned, we've seen anything ranging from squirrels to cougars walking past this area, and it gives you a sense of that kind of community level structure that an area might have. Another reason why they're so popular is because they monitor 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, day and night, through all weather conditions. And again, that's an advantage over some other traditional monitoring techniques that might be weather dependent. So if you're doing a tracking survey, you need some relatively fresh snow on the ground. Or if you're maybe looking for ungulates in the springtime, you need that spring green up to occur to bring them more out into the open. Where a camera trap can kind of function throughout the day in a passive manner to collect some information on the abundance and distribution of certain wildlife species. And then third, why I think they're becoming pretty popular is because the tool is so relatable to the general public. The raw data is an image. Oftentimes it's an image of an animal, and usually it's an animal acting relatively natural in its habitat. Of course, you definitely get those sequence of pictures where a deer is keyed in on the camera and it's all up close to the lens, or a bear is rubbing or sniffing at the camera. But oftentimes too, you get this candid image of an animal using its habitat, which is pretty neat for the general public. And these are also accessible to the general public. And so you get hunters and trappers and naturalists, private landowners, using these sorts of things to kind of understand what's going on around them. And what's neat there is there's an opportunity to engage with the public for citizen science projects where they can submit their photos to large landscape level monitoring projects and have the information that they collect contribute to these larger monitoring projects that are happening around them. So we're standing on the edge of kind of a transition zone that's unfolding here over time. You can see a recently chewed up tree that the beavers have felled here. And if you have a look at the canopy above me here, these conifers are still alive and they're green. And if we look behind us towards the beaver pond and up towards the canopy, you'll notice all those trees are dead or dying. And so this is what we would expect, and this is why beavers are kind of good for these sorts of forests. In this case, this is a young second growth forest with a fairly high stem density and a high canopy. So in patches like this, you get this very tight forest structure that doesn't get a lot of sun down to the forest floor. And so you don't get a lot of vegetation and forage growing in the forest, which is important food for obviously a lot of wildlife critters. We're on the edge of a beaver pond like this with time, especially as beavers take down more trees and these trees fall over naturally because they've died and have been flooded out. We'll see this vegetation component change and more sun will reach the forest floor here. We'll see more forage grow up, and this will become a pretty important little forage patch for all sorts of animals. So here in the Beaver Lodge lands, we're using just 1 or 2 cameras to look at a very specific habitat feature. But as mentioned, this tool can also be used to assist with wildlife and habitat monitoring objectives at much broader areas. For example, in the Campbell River Natural Resource District, we currently have over 30 remote camera stations set up to help with projects such as monitoring for the presence and seasonal activity patterns of deer and elk in established ungulate winter ranges, to help with monitoring the effectiveness of these habitat designations. We're also using remote cameras as part of a larger elk habitat selection project to literally take a daily snapshot of snow depth and snow cover to build a model of winter severity to help inform how elk use different habitats during different winter conditions. It's always fascinating to go up to these cameras and pull the cards. You just never know what you're gonna get. And even here in the Beav, we've seen some pretty neat changes over time. We've seen the beavers build the dams. We've seen the stream morphology change from a creek into this ponding, more wetland type habitat. And of course, we've seen a whole variety of wildlife using this space. One of the more interesting things I think we've seen here in the Beaver Lodge lands in the height of the summer is we've seen a number of different bears coming in and using these ponds as an area to soak and cool off in the heat of the summertime. If nothing else, this sort of information gives us a good reminder that we share this space with wildlife. I think a lot of folks can walk through the Beaver Lodge lands and maybe never have an encounter with these animals, but certainly these cameras give us a new perspective and a good reminder that we do share this space. And so there's some things that we can do to kind of help stay wild smart and continue to use these spaces safely. There's a lot of good resources online, and if folks have questions about that sort of thing, I'd encourage them to check it out. Thanks for joining us on this virtual tour through the Beaver Lodge lands. Enjoy the trails and stay safe.